Considering how pleasant and upbeat my SNK videos were, any of you who might be new to my game industry commentary might misunderstand what kind of spirit it usually comes from, so allow me to present a more typical example of what gets me talking. Anyone who knows me offline or is simply familiar with my work on Smashpad and its podcasts already knows that I have strong opinions about Final Fantasy XV. Truthfully, it has deeper roots in this wholesale move toward action RPGs that the JRPG genre has taken in recent years, but Final Fantasy's current caretakers in particular seem to have adopted a really self-loathing position when it comes to the franchise's own traditions, and that's something I find deeply disturbing. To be fair, Hajime Tabata and his team can be granted some measure of latitude, if only for the rather sad reason that very few Final Fantasy games released in the latter half of the brand's existence have been somewhat consistent with their labeling, compared to the series' first half, which you could practically set your clock by. Moreover, it was Tabata who brought us Final Fantasy Type 0, which, if a game isn't to be consistent with its labeling, still turned out very good, so there is a certain measure of goodwill accumulated there. Speaking purely as a game developer, the man has my respect. It's his open disdain for what he apparently calls diseased fans who have attachments to the series' classic identity that makes me want to cordially invite him to fornicate himself with a tree branch. But I'm not here simply to put Final Fantasy XV on blast for ignoring its roots where it counts. I've done plenty of that on the Day Zero update, and it's really not unprecedented for a long-running, even legendary franchise like Final Fantasy to shed its identity in the often misguided hunt for those AAA dollars. I don't respect it, but it has happened before, and it will be a fact of life in the industry for as long as publishers find any discomfort in their own skin or just misunderstand the segment of the market their strengths and weaknesses would have them occupy. What really strikes me as insipid and scummy about the promotion of this game is the truly amazing pandering toward fans of the very titles Tabata and his team are trying to distance themselves from. You don't get to drum up Final Fantasy XV as the last hope of a series, or the JRPG genre, or of console gaming as a whole, when it isn't even recognizable as a Final Fantasy. You don't get to dismiss classic Final Fantasy as archaic and outdated, as both Tabata and the crew working on Final Fantasy VII Remake have, be it implicitly or explicitly, and then pull in series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi to try and reel us back in with a desperate endorsement. You certainly don't get to bitch and moan about fans and staff alike strongly believing in a deeper identity for the franchise having some kind of Final Fantasy disease when the lion's share of your 3-minute TV ad was comprised of the original promo spots for the very games those fans and staff want back. And that TV spot was absolutely mystifying in context, honestly. Who the hell let it out of its cage? Hey, remember all those great JRPGs you played back in the day? Man, those were great times, weren't they? Oh hey, also, you remember those other times since then that we just kind of shit the bed? Well, here's the thing. We just made this new game that probably should have been mercy killed at least 7 years ago, and even though we're borderline resentful of all those old classics and actively trying to avoid making anything in that vein, we pissed away so much money trying to salvage it that we more or less have to sell Call of Duty numbers in order to avoid a catastrophe of spirits within proportions. We need the whole squad on board, and even though most of us weren't even here to make those foundational games, you still love Square Enix enough to help us out here, right? Their rhetoric might also be a lot more convincing if they weren't so clearly concerned with rival publisher Atlus and their big-ticket classical JRPG Persona 5. A poll aimed at Japanese fans late last year tellingly asked gamers their overall preference between Final Fantasy XV and Persona 5, as well as which game they were inclined to pick up between the two if they were to share a release window, which, at least in Japan, we now know they will. Interesting. On a side note, you have to love Atlus's swagger here. Launching Persona 5 within sniffing distance of Final Fantasy XV on the calendar sends a clear message of, you were right to want to duck a direct fight with us on store shelves, but we're coming for your fucking heads anyway. I can only hope Atlus USA can follow suit with a September launch, so I can personally and directly take their side with my own money. The situation becomes even more bizarre but strangely encouraging when viewed in a company-wide lens. Square Enix just recently, in industry terms, welcomed a new president, Yosuke Matsuda, who was pleasantly surprised by the warm reception received by Bravely Default in the West, as well as visibly irritated by the money Square Enix missed out on by leaving the game's Western publishing rights to Nintendo. At the time, Matsuda proclaimed that one of his main initiatives for the company was to return it to the path of deeply traditional JRPGs, yet around the same time Final Fantasy XV development went into full full swing. So what happened exactly? At a glance it may appear that Matsuda is simply so bad at managing egos that his teams are left to their own devices, making whatever they want regardless of the boss's vision for the company's direction, but I don't think that's true at all. Rather, I suspect Matsuda is just being realistic that the company he inherited was suffering tremendously from a scorching case of late-stage Final Fantasy XV and to a lesser extent Kingdom Hearts III, but recognized that it had also just about run its course, so seeing it through to release was less damaging, at least from a board relations perspective, than canceling it outright and leaving the entire investment on the table. Thus, Matsuda remains on the sidelines for the time being, allowing Tabata his talk of Final Fantasy disease and the future of the JRPG genre being inextricably tied to the success of the largely unrelated Final Fantasy XV. After all, the purported 10 million sales required for 15 to be deemed successful after the substantial investment that has gone into it for the past decade will be nearly impossible to reach even if Tabata's provocations can manage to bring a good number of so-called diseased holdouts to heel. But that whole mess is another video entirely. Tabata simply doesn't need Matsuda out there proclaiming Square Enix's return to its roots while trying to sell a game that goes against everything that would entail, and neither does Matsuda himself if he wants to maximize Final Fantasy XV's return, which, regardless of any other motivations he might have, he should. Don't ignore what Matsuda's doing on the down low, however. The establishment of Tokyo RPG Factory, announced at E3 last year, was mostly drowned out by news of the Final Fantasy VII remake, but it effectively serves as Matsuda's first major landscape-altering act as company president, and is quite telling of his intentions. Compared to the high-budget, almost inevitably low-yield in comparison Final Fantasy XV, I Am Setsuna enjoys both a development cycle and an overall style reminiscent of Square Enix at their best. Let's also not forget how the company is loading Steam up with ports of classic Final Fantasy titles. The mobile side of things is as strong as it has ever been, and that we're seeing more activity out of the Ultra JRPG Hardcore Saga franchise than we have in years, with Romancing Saga 2 remake, Imperial Saga, and Saga Scarlet Grace all coming in on Matsuda's yet brief watch. Slowly but surely, the company is quietly transforming in Matsuda's image. Just don't expect the changes to take center stage until sometime around TGS, once we're on the other side of the Final Fantasy XV launch and the company no longer has to hold firm behind Tabata's provocative messaging. Sometime between TGS 2016 and 2017, we should have a much clearer picture of Square Enix's long-term plans, which I'll speculate about here because it'll be fun to revisit in the future. First off, it should be just about time for Tokyo RPG Factory to tip their hand on what's coming next, maybe as soon as E3 in 2 weeks, but certainly no later than TGS. Tabata, meanwhile, will get the project he's wanted for quite some time now, which is Final Fantasy Type 1. Tabata will see it as a reward for his work on Final Fantasy XV, while Matsuda might look at it as retaining quality talent without keeping him at the helm of Square Enix's flagship brand. It will be a very good game, and Tabata will enjoy making it. It's a situation that, like Final Fantasy XV itself, can likely be molded as needed to fit the narrative moving forward, which is of course Matsuda's hard move back to classical JRPGs. The relative performance of Final Fantasy XV and I Am Setsuna will undoubtedly be brought to bear on the Final Fantasy VII remake, perhaps directly influencing its gameplay direction while it's still deep in development. Back to Tokyo RPG Factory. I would expect another spectacular stopgap title or two, give or take a Chrono Trigger revival, before the big news that Final Fantasy is joining in the classic franchise renaissance rush, and that Final Fantasy XVI is being developed with an encompassing mentality of bringing the franchise home. The development team, operating under the guidance of Tokyo RPG Factory, would ideally consist of developers primarily in their mid-30s to early 40s, with a particular reverence for the Super NES and PS1 eras. The irony, of course, is that a team with that mentality, united in the goal of restoring the Final Fantasy name to its former glory by way of reclaiming every facet of its identity, rather than just some thematic consistencies, would most likely be as loved and revered as Tabata had called out members of his own team for believing they themselves would surely be. The point I'm trying to make is embrace your Final Fantasy disease if you have it. Regardless of what Tabata says or believes, the JRPG genre will move on, healthier than it's been in years, and with or without the Final Fantasy series, but it probably isn't even going to come to that. Looking at mobile and other side projects, the will is clearly there within the company to bring Final Fantasy back to tradition, and the only thing they seem to be waiting for before bringing such an effort into full effect is maximizing their return on Final Fantasy XV. In the meantime, just try not getting sucked up into Tabata's drama queen attitude. The genre is healthier than it has ever been. Just take a glance at this summer's release list if you don't believe me.